This is Top of Mind. I'm Julie Rose. We are here daily with in-depth conversations about what's happening in your world. If it's top of mind, we'll talk about it. First, new reports declare human trafficking a rampant problem in the Thai fishing industry that supplies the biggest names in pet food. We'll speak with an investigative reporter who has seen the problem firsthand. Then, the truth about holiday weight gain. And the widower who unwittingly launched the hashtag 100 Love Notes internet sensation that has people the world over declaring their love for one another. During the second hour, how kids and money may explain why college grads are more likely to marry than Americans with less education. We'll also consider how companies and communities can better support women who suffer a miscarriage. Finally, the author of a comprehensive guide to female screenwriters around the world on why we need more movies written by women. Join the conversation. Find us on Twitter. We are at BYU Top. It's good to have you with us. Human trafficking at sea is top of mind today. A rising chorus of advocacy groups and food manufacturers are acknowledging that labor and human rights abuses are rampant in the fishing industry that supplies the largest pet food makers in America. Nestle acknowledged the scale of the problem in a report released last week that tells of migrant workers lured onto Thai fishing boats and forced to work under inhumane conditions in what amounts to indentured servitude. There are now class action lawsuits and proposed legislation in the United States aimed at forcing the makers of brands including IAMS, Meow Mix, Fancy Feast, and Purina to ensure that they do not buy fish from boats that enslave migrant workers. I'm joined by Ian Urbina, investigative reporter for the New York Times. His in-depth series over the summer called The Outlaw Ocean has been cited by members of Congress and the State Department in their efforts to rein in abuses by the Thai fishing industry. Hello, Ian. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
These claims are not new, unfortunately. Your reports depict the human trafficking on the seas as a well-oiled system, really. How did it get to be such a widespread thing?
Well, the answer sort of varies by region. In the case of the South China Sea, where Thailand is, there's a distinct story, and it has a lot to do with the fact that Thailand is a nearly middle-class country, and most Thais are not willing to take these days jobs on these boats. And so there is a large migrant inflow from Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar, and those migrants are easily abused and trafficked from the border to the boats, and the boats are sent offshore. And so in some ways, it's a problem with several layers. You know, these are an already invisible and vulnerable people who are then being put on boats and sort of disappeared across the horizon, and usually the boats are also unregistered. So there are several layers of invisibility surrounding the problem.
Is it really the kind of work that people would not want to do otherwise unless they were duped into it? I mean, you've documented deceptive recruitment practices, you know, promising these folks one thing and then having them sort of suckered into this indentured servitude in really horrific situations. Why are these boats unable to employ people on the up and up?
Mm-hmm. So most, I'd say all of the reporting thus far had been recounting of conditions on the boats by migrants and deckhands who escaped them. One of the things we had set out to do with the series was try to actually get on the boats themselves, the ones that are most notorious for severe abuse. And these are the boats that are transshipment boats. They're the ones that are furthest from shore, and they stay at sea, sometimes for years, and they fish continually. Boats go out, pick up the fish, drop off ice and parts and fuel, and the fishing boats just continue to work. And those are the boats that, you know, really had the serious reputation for slavery, and the ones that we had, Adam Dean, the photographer, and I had wanted to get on. It took some doing, but we finally got on several, one in particular that we stayed on and documented the conditions. And to answer your question, they're quite brutal. The conditions are severe. They're very dangerous. A lot of men crowded on a small, sometimes unseaworthy boat. a lot of machinery, really rough conditions, horrible sanitation. The one we were on was, rat infested. And on that boat there were 40 Cambodian boys and men, all of them indentured, and sort of stuck there and not able to leave until their debt was paid off, or their captain simply decided to let them go.
Describe, if you would, Ian, Urbina, and you gave many examples, so just pick one if you would, the path from that these young men and boys follow to end up on one of these boats for years and years at a time with really no way of escaping. I mean, how do they start off in Cambodia or Myanmar and end up on the boat?
So we looked at one guy in particular in one of our stories. He was a young man who came from Cambodia. He was from a small village, very, very poor. He heard of a job opportunity with a trafficker could bring him into the country. He thought it was in construction. Trafficker brought him in. Next thing he knows, he's at the port. Next thing he knows, he's on a boat. This individual, his name was Lang Long, then was at sea for 2.5 years. He tried to escape, and his captain, the first captain of 3 boats, shackled him by the neck and kept him shackled whenever other boats approached, so that Lang Long would not escape. And he was sold from that boat at sea to another boat, and subsequently to a third. And finally, some supply boat saw his conditions, saw him shackled, and essentially bought his freedom after long negotiations, and he made it his way back to shore. It's not an atypical story.
Slaveholding, though, I mean, technically it's not legal, right? So when there's a negotiation going on, I mean, what's being purchased in order to free this young man?
It's not legal, but it's quite a reality. And when you're out there, the law is a malleable thing. The captain is God on these ships, and you're 150 miles offshore. There are no police out there. So the captain of that ship is not going to let one of his crew members go willingly. And so in the case of Lang Long's story, the sort of NGO that raised the money and sent a guy out on the supply ship to buy his freedom knew that the only way they were going to get him off there was if they paid for him. So it was not a legal transaction, but it was a transaction that's not atypical.
There is also this phenomenon you document. It's tragic, really, of kind of an indentured servitude where individuals have to pay for training, or maybe they have to pay for documents. It's not entirely clear to me. They pay the human trafficker, or maybe somehow basically they end up incurring more debt as they work, and so they're never actually in the free and clear with the ability to say, "I'm done here. I'm going home next time we head to port." Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole other industry, and that story was based in the Philippines, which produces a quarter of the world's seafarers, and there's an organized program of exporting workers to sea from the Philippines. And for that story, we looked at this sort of niche industry of manning agencies, which are companies that essentially specialize in producing men for ships. And these manning agencies, some of them are legitimate, others are not. And the illegitimate ones, the illegal ones, prey on villagers and do exactly what you say. They take huge upfront fees and essentially dupe small villagers into paying a fair amount of money for access to a job that they promise will pay, $500 a month. They get on a plane, they end up in Singapore, and they find out once they're there and their passport is in the trafficker's hands that the job is actually only going to pay $100 a month. They get on the boat because they have no option, and a lot of these guys end up on Taiwanese tuna longliners, and they work there for a while. The abuse on those boats is so severe, a lot of them try to escape, and when they do, if they get lucky, they make their way home, and they have not a cent to show for it. They have a lot of debt instead because they borrowed money to get the job in the first place.
I'm speaking with Ian Urbina, investigative reporter for the New York Times. His in-depth series over the summer called The Outlaw Ocean, and a lot of his follow-up reporting has really revealed the stark human rights abuses taking place in the fishing industry in Southeast Asia, the Thai fishing industry among them, also in the Philippines. How big a deal is it? How significant is it to you, in your mind, that Nestle, this international corporation has actually released this report that they commissioned by this NGO that essentially says, yes, our pet food includes fish that was fished under these inhumane conditions.
I think it's a big deal. I think it's a big deal in that, a very large, they claim to be the world's largest food company, has reckoned to some degree with the realities out there. I think that's the first step. They are facing a lot of pressure. Purina and Nestle is looking at a class action lawsuit out of California, and I think it's part of what will be legislation, likely federal and state, that will focus a lot of these food companies and transparency and accountability in their supply chain. I think that the real question, though, is what happens next. Will Nestle or other companies, Thai Union, these big fishing companies, the big grocery store chains, will they commit to real fixes, that work to get more supply chain accountability and transparency, so that we all know where the food is coming from that we serve to our animals or eat ourselves. And also we know the conditions of the workers that get that food.
It's easier said than done. One of the things that was really enlightening to me about your reporting, Ian Urbina, is getting a taste of how convoluted the supply chain really is. It's not as though Nestle is, out there buying fish directly from boats that have these deplorable conditions, right? I mean, there's so many different middlemen. Maybe you could walk us through what we know about how far removed our pet food is here in America from the slave conditions you've been describing to us.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. I mean, the globalized economy is one with layers of subcontractors and subcontractors. It is true when it comes to coffee. It is true when it comes to clothing. It is true when it comes to food. And the maritime space is an especially tough one because there's that extra layer of distance, where the boats are out there on the sea and they're so far from government oversight. So that makes the maritime space even tougher than, say, anti-sweatshop worker, concerns with Bangladesh garments, So I think, though, what I hear from experts when it comes to what can be done is all these boats ultimately have to come back to port. At some point, they need to either offload their catch to another boat, which brings it to port, or they themselves bring it to port. And port state control, the guy with a clipboard at the dock, is really where pressure can be exerted for some sort of accountability. Still, it's not a silver bullet because you can't know for sure that the fish caught on the fishing boat, the transshipment fishing boat that stays out there, you don't know the conditions of the workers on that boat, even if you've got a really rigorous system at the dock. And so there need to be some fixes put in place to curtail transshipment or get more oversight on that system.
Whose jurisdiction is that out there on the high seas, though? I mean, is it because is it Thailand's job to be out there with police boats, tracking these folks and doing spot checks? I mean, is that just completely outside the realm of possibility?
I think it is. I mean, the sea is too big. 2/3 of the planet's covered in water, and no country, certainly not the poorer countries that produce most of the stuff that we consume in the West, have the resources to police the high seas, much less their territorial waters. So, really, jurisdiction will probably be at the port where the stuff comes in, whatever that stuff is, and that's where you have sort of two pressure points. You either have consumer and corporate-led pressure being exerted from the market side, big players like we're seeing with Nestle, or you have governments, that say, look, if stuff is going to come through our ports and we're going to tax it and we're going to make money off of it and we're going to export it, then we are going to have certain rules that we impose, and So you have both of those. And you also have large institutional consumers. So, the U.S. government is a large institutional buyer of fish, shrimp and, salmon and lobster and all sorts of fish for military bases, and for USDA school lunch program buys a lot of tuna. One single institution like the U.S. government or Whole Foods can exert a lot of pressure if they say from now on we're only going to buy, fish that has these traceability conditions along with it. That affects the marketplace, and it gets all the way back to Thailand and all the way back to the transshipment boats because they want access to those buyers.
How big of a player is the United States in this market? Are we that big of a consumer of the fish that's coming out of the Thai fishing industry in the Philippines and the South China Sea?
I probably should know numbers. I don't. I know that we are a big player. Obviously Asia consumes more fish per capita than we do, but the three big players are Asia writ large, the EU, and the U.S. And I think in the order, if I'm not mistaken, it's Asia 1, EU number 2, U.S. 3.
So does it make that big of a difference then? Can the United States, if enough American consumers, and I guess we're not just talking about pet food here, we're talking about fish, farm-raised fish are often fed meal that's brought in by these fishing, these transshipment boats, and I guess even tuna you mentioned could potentially be wrapped up in all of this?
Yeah, all fish suffers from this. We just looked at animal-fed fish because it's an area that rarely gets attention, and livestock and pet feed is a huge area. But, yeah, the same issues apply to human-consumed fish as non-human consumed fish. And to answer your first question, the U.S. may not be as big as Asia, but it's still a huge consumer of these types of fish. And if the U.S., pushed for something, in all likelihood the EU would be close behind or right in front of us on those policies, and those two alone would change the marketplace alone, even if Asia was sort of slow to follow.
One of the biggest suppliers of fish out of the Thailand fishing industry is this company called Thai Union, which you write about a lot in your reports, Ian Urbina. And spokespeople for Thai Union have said we are, committed to eradicating human trafficking from our supply line. What has proven so? That would seem really promising. Why has it proven such a thorny problem for the folks, basically there on the ground buying fish at port to try to get rid of the human trafficking supply within their own chain?
What a company says and what they do are not always the same thing. I'm not saying that's the case here, but simply that I can't find a company that doesn't say they're against human trafficking. I'd love to see one, but all companies say that. Now, the question is what they're actually doing concretely to address the problem, and that's where it gets difficult, right? Transshipment. Thai Union has said they no longer will use transshipment. They won't rely on these boats that are left out there for long periods of time. What they haven't said, though, is what will they do with regard to the vast majority of the fish that they buy from other contractors that use transshipment. Most of the Thai Union fish that we consume is coming off of Trimarine and other companies that you've never heard of and that I hadn't heard of. And Thai Union hasn't said they will stop buying from those third-party vendors who use transshipment. They've just said on their own boats they will stop using transshipment. Well, if you look at the percent of fish that's coming from Thai Union boats in Thai waters that's been transshipped, it's not a huge amount. So, the devil is always in the detail as to, kind of what these companies are willing to do to change their practices.
And there's so much money involved here. I guess that's really what always leads people down these paths to human rights abuses. I'm just curious, finally, Ian Urbina, you were on one of these ships where these conditions were underway. And I wonder if you think it would help at all. One of the reforms, this Nestle report calls for some reforms that are aimed at the workers themselves, giving them written contracts, prohibiting the kinds of fees that could turn into an indentured servitude situation. Would those kinds of reforms? Do you think that the people who are inclined to become enslaved on these ships, that given the right kind of information and the right kind of conditions before they get on the boat, that they could actually protect themselves?
Yeah, I mean, look, contracts are good things when it comes to labor rights. So there's a lot of good discussion about what should be done, and having contracts and requiring boats to come back every 6 months to port, and all these things are great. The big issue is always laws are only as good as their enforcement, and kind of what enforcement will exist to ensure that those measures have teeth. And that's, again, a place where one needs to pay very close attention. So a contract in principle is a great thing, but what are the consequences for not having a contract? Who's going to enforce the obligation for a company to give a worker a contract? And what are the penalties if they're caught not providing a contract or living up to it? These are the things that actually matter and will affect change, and sort of it's in the details that I think, the discussion needs to go to.
And what's a consumer to do if they don't want to be part of the problem? Here in the United States, should you just stop eating fish that hasn't been, fished locally? It just sounds, virtually impossible to know at the grocery store what's been tainted and what hasn't by this human trafficking problem.
It's such a hard question. I mean, and it's a really fair question, and I wish I had a good answer. I think I have a poor answer, which is, you try to inform yourself, you try to read up on, kind of what labeling is emerging, kind of good practices, best practices, labeling, a seal of approval from an organization that says this is not slave caught. This company has been widely reviewed as having better practices. I mean, that's the most that we can do as consumers, is try to inform ourselves and try to buy things that seem to have better practices. And then, the standard things, talk to lawmakers and, sort of get involved with groups that are trying to fix these matters. I think that's as much as we can do.
Ian Urbina, thank you so much for your time and your important work on this topic.
Thanks for having me.